Let's keep talking about skeletal muscles, voluntary muscles. This is kind of an idea that we'll explain going on, but make a note. When we were looking at the thin filament, the one, the actin, we saw troponin and tropomyosin. And calcium actually binds to the troponin, not the tropomyosin. Be good to know. We'll see it in the picture coming up. All of this is getting that actin ready to move. When a muscle contracts, it goes through cross-bridging cycling. Cycling means this is like a cycle. It just repeats over and over and over. Think about technically when you're driving a car. Each revolution of the wheel is just one cycle. And if you drive a long way, there may be, I don't know, thousands or tens of thousands of cycles as you drive from New York to California. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. I would be able to identify and put in order the 4 repeating steps. First, we make a cross bridge. Myosin attaches to the actin. Thick grabs thin. Myosin is the thick, actin is the thin. After we make that cross bridge where the 2 pieces connect, we go through the power stroke. The myosin pulls toward the center of the sarcomere. Thick grabs thin and pulls it in toward the middle. This is active, so it takes ATP. And when we talked about energy, we saw that ATP can break down into ADP with an extra phosphate. Once this energy is done, the power stroke is complete, then it lets go. The myosin head releases from the actin. But here's another idea. It takes ATP to let go. It takes energy to end a contraction. After this ATP is spent and the myosin or the thick lets go of the thin, then it has to reset. And that ATP is going to split back into the parts that it started from, ADP and phosphate. And the enzyme is going to help make that happen. Quick review, here's thick filaments. These are thin filaments. I'm going to jump over here. On the thin filaments, we have tropomyosin. The myosin is like the string. We also have troponin. Troponin is the one that calcium actually binds to. Calcium binds to the troponin, which is on the thin filament. Remember, the thin filament is mostly actin. Separately is the thick filament, and here's that filament head. When calcium binds, it only binds to the thin filament. After that is when they start to make this cross bridge. Now that calcium is up there, thick grabs thin. That's the cross bridging. Thick grabs thin. They talk about how it's like a cocked position, pulling the bow back. Then there's the power stroke. Look at the way this filament head was here, and it contracted in. Everything is getting pulled toward the midline. Here, when we're relaxed, there's a lot of space in the middle. But the power stroke, thick grabs thin and pulls it in toward the midline. Once it's contracted, it can't stay there forever. So here's where ATP is involved. ATP to release this cross bridge. Thick lets go of thin. That's what allows thick, or the myosin head, to reset. So again, it's the cycle. The whole time we're working out, or the whole time a muscle is moving, every time you take a step, calcium comes in. Calcium binds to the troponin. Then we get a cross bridge. Thick grabs thin, and power stroke pulls it in. Now things are more toward the midline. Can't stay that way because now you're putting weight onto a different muscle. You're going to keep on walking. So we got to let go. We release. Thick lets go of thin. And thick, or the myosin head, resets. This continues as long as there's calcium and ATP present to kind of fuel the process. The end result is the sarcomere shortened, right? Everything went toward the midline. Or we could say the Z-disc moved closer towards each other. And that middle stuff kind of disappeared. But here's a big idea. The filaments always stay the same length. They just slide past each other. Let's put that together in this picture. Here we have a relaxed muscle, thick and thin filaments. Everything is spaced out. This muscle is relaxed. This muscle is contracted. Everything has gotten pulled in toward the midline. But this thick filament is the exact same length as it was when it was relaxed. These thin filaments are the same length when they're relaxed and contracted. Everything just slides past each other. Big idea. These filaments themselves don't shorten or lengthen. They just slide past each other. A couple of pathologies that go with this. Tetanus. You've heard of a tetanus shot. Clostridium tetani is a bacteria that causes a pathology called tetanus, which is why we need tetanus shots or tetanus vaccinations. I'll share that even when I had my motorcycle accident a few years ago, while I was in the emergency room, not right away, right? They're making sure I was alive and that there were no broken bones or internal bleeding. But within that emergency room visit, they gave me a tetanus shot, and they were just saying that you need one every 10 years, and we find that people my age haven't had them in a while. If we don't get these, this bacterial infection can actually cause some really nasty paralysis. The muscles can get overstimulated and contract too hard. Another bacterial infection can be involved with botulism. And this one doesn't really affect the muscle so much as it does those synaptic knobs in the neurotransmitter. And interestingly, botulism can be fatal, but some Botox injections involve very, very weakened and often dead collections of botulism. So it's just kind of interesting that this is a nasty pathology that we've learned to at least have some medicinal benefits. When a skeletal muscle contracts, we went through that. Remember that the filaments do not shorten, they overlap. Then we have to relax. We're going to relax once we get out of that, once we run out of the neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter was broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. Basically, we get rid of all the charge. There's no more end plate potential, so there's no more action potential. And all of those voltage-gated channels that were held open by the electricity start to close. Remember that our sarcoplasmic reticulum inside those muscle cells actually stores some calcium. As soon as the neurotransmitter is gone, that sarcoplasmic reticulum says, let me grab some calcium and store it for the next time I'm needed. That troponin and tropdomyosin kind of relax. I think about that as closing the door. And basically everything returns to its original position. It would stay relaxed until it got another nerve signal and more acetylcholine was released. Where does our energy come from? Interestingly, inside our muscles, we only have about 5 seconds worth of ATP. If you quit making ATP, you would be paralyzed in most of your voluntary muscles, definitely after a minute. Most muscles only have enough for 5 seconds of intense activity. Think about ATP. It's explosive, right? And so we probably don't store ATP, but we don't have much ATP in store, but we do have some stuff that we can make some ATP. We have an enzyme inside the muscle called myokinase. Remember, ACE tells us it's an enzyme. And that would help us make some ATP. But again, just for a few seconds. I mean, if I start going upstairs, I'm only going to get maybe to the second floor using up the ATP that's inside my muscle cell. If I stay with inside the muscle cell, I'm also going to use some creatine phosphate to get extra ATP. I can do glycolysis, and I can do aerobic cellular respiration. This should be ringing a bell. We've talked about these things back in Module 1. So all of this relates to energy, my muscle metabolism, specifically my skeletal muscle. Creatine phosphate. A lot of people who work out take creatine as a supplement, and it helps provide that high energy bond. Remember ADP and ATP. ADP just means there's 2 phosphate, diphosphate, and ATP means there's 3 phosphate. And it's this creatine phosphate that helps to take ADP and make it into ATP. We use another enzyme, creatine kinase. So now instead of 5 seconds of energy, boom, now I can last 15 seconds of energy. I can make it up to the 3rd floor of stairs maybe if I'm going. Glycolysis, we spent a lot of time dealing with that, and some big ideas was glycolysis is anaerobic. It does not require energy. Glycolysis is when we start with glucose. We probably pulled that from our blood, or here in the voluntary muscles, maybe we use some of that glycogen where we stored it in there. But glucose gets broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules. Big idea, glycolysis only gives me 2 more ATP, right? I don't have to breathe hard. It doesn't give me much more energy. Glycolysis happened in that cytosol, in that fluid-like stuff of a cell. If I really start needing energy, that's when we started getting into cellular respiration. Yeah, we would go past the glycolysis. Back then we were talking about an intermediate stage that took us to Krebs cycle, but all of that started happening in the mitochondria. Here's where really my endurance energy is going to come from. That pyruvate that I made in glycolysis, it gets oxidized, but it builds up carbon dioxide. I mean, this is poison stuff. It also, remember we had those like power pellets, those tokens, that NADH and FADH, and we could cache those in once we went through that electron transport chain. Big idea. If I'm doing cellular respiration, now I can get 30 ATP. When we were doing glycolysis, we were only getting 2 ATP. Another cool thing about cellular respiration is I can break down fats and use those for fuel, and a couple of other things that involve fatty acids, and use all of that for fuel to make ATP. Here's a skeletal muscle cell, a blood vessel. Ways to get energy. Inside the cell, remember there's not much of this. I only have very, very limited ATP. The example they said was maybe 5 seconds of intense energy. And most of that is ADP combining to make ATP. Or maybe using creatine in ADP to make ATP. But there's not much of this going on. If I need a little bit more energy, then I can go into glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis happens in the fluid part of the cell, and that's when I take glucose and break it down into actually 2 pyruvates. That's going to give me just 2 ATP. Glucose, glycolysis. Still not breathing hard, but I'm outside of the mitochondria. If I really need energy, then is when I go through that citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. I'm breathing hard, so this is aerobic, having to really fuel this system, and also get rid of all the carbon dioxide that's building up right here. But if I make it all the way to here, then I'm really forming about that 30 ATPs. If I'm building all of this, much more stuff is coming from the blood, and even my waste products have to go into the blood. They're showing oxygen is coming from the blood to make it to this aerobic cellular respiration. When I was going through glycolysis, all I needed was glucose coming from the blood. A little bit more in this video. Hang in there. So as I'm going through this, that pyruvate that I got from the glycolysis leaves me with something called lactate or lactic acid is what we're going to talk about here. All of this was a natural product because we use this enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. What's that tell you? What's it doing? If I'm dehydrating something, I'm pulling hydrogen off, right? I'm changing its charge. I'm changing its a little bit, changing its pH, changing its ions. All of that's involved with this. What happened is lactate can be involved with skeletal muscle like a fuel. Oftentimes, though, it just enters my blood and goes back to the liver. My liver is going to break it down. So that's called the lactic acid cycle. Basically, my muscle built up lactate. Lactate went into the blood, went to the liver, and my liver takes this same thing and turns it back into glucose. Then it's going to send that glucose into my blood, and then the exact same molecule may go back to that muscle and be used again and again. So some big ideas. How do we get our energy? If I'm looking at less than 10 seconds, then I'm just staying with that phosphate system, right? That was the ADP combining to ADP or the creatine. Once I'm running somewhere closer to like 45 seconds, I'm using glycolysis. Why glycolysis? Because I can hold my breath for 45 seconds. Glycolysis is anaerobic, making more ATP than I was doing up here. But if I'm sprinting, definitely anything I'm doing intense exercise more than 60 seconds, even some of these videos I feel like, wait, I get pumped up and going in here. But if I'm going for a while, I have to start breathing more. It's an aerobic process, and that's what's providing my energy past the first 60 seconds. So I like this demonstration here. Let's get that. Here's where everybody started. Everybody started there. I'm going to pull my pen marker off so we can see our numbers there. Everybody starts there. And this first part here, about the first 5 or 6 seconds, enough to run about 50 meters, or if you're a football player, halfway down a football field, takes about 5 seconds to go 50 meters. All of that is happening in that immediate transfer of phosphate. Remember, ADP, ADP, or ADP plus creatine phosphate. It only gives me about 5 seconds of energy. The second one, I'm doing glycolysis, and it's going to last me up to about a minute. But still, I'm not going to make it all the way around the track here, making it just that far. The third one, if I'm running and I've been running for more than a minute, this person is the one who's truly doing aerobic cellular respiration, having to go all the way down and activate those mitochondrial processes with the electron transport. But this person is building up a lot, actually all three of them, but especially this person, is building up a lot of what's called oxygen debt. It's the oxygen needed after exercise, enough to return, to restore to our previous condition. If you've ever seen somebody just cross a finish line in a race and they're, it's exactly what oxygen debt looks like. But also when you're rushing because you had trouble parking and you're trying to get to class and you're just breathing a little bit harder, you have a little bit of oxygen debt. The goals of oxygen debt is to refinish our hemoglobin and myoglobin. This really will tie into 224, but basically put oxygen back into our blood and put oxygen back into our muscles. Help restore that glycogen that we've lost, that we just used up. We also used up our creatine phosphate. So part of oxygen debt is increased circulation to get more creatine phosphate back in there. And then, like we said, one of the products of this is my muscles would build up lactic acid. And so I need this increased circulation, especially for a little while after intense exercise, to get that lactic acid back into my bloodstream so that my liver can process it. All right, great job, everybody. We'll keep going in the next video.